The Man Who Borrowed a Future That Wasn't His, Shadow Prophet I, Part 1. He had never said "I love you" without first checking whether the universe would approve. That was the truth, stripped of the polite language he used when he explained himself to friends, therapists, and the one priest he visited in the year he tried to become religious just to see if God offered better forecasting than machines. He did not love in the way other people loved. He did not leap. He did not burn. He did not gamble with his chest. He audited his feelings. He treated desire like a suspicious transaction. He treated devotion like a contract that required verification. And he treated the future, tomorrow, next month, next year, as a service that ought to answer when called, like a receptionist whose only job was to confirm reservations. His name was Elias Mercer. 38, clean hands, clean shoes, clean opinions, the kind of man who looked like he had never once shouted in a room without immediately apologizing to the walls. His apartment was a museum of carefulness, neutral colors, furniture with no sharp edges, framed prints of landscapes that implied distance but never danger. The refrigerator was organized by expiration dates. His closet contained clothes selected for being appropriate, not beautiful. Even his coffee maker ran on a schedule. And above his desk, in a place of honor where another man might hang a wedding photo or a child's drawing, Elias kept the only altar he had ever worshipped, a wall-mounted screen displaying forecasts. Not weather, not markets, not traffic. His. A private system, fed by every data stream he could legally buy, and a few he couldn't. Social signals, linguistic patterns, micro-expressions extracted from video calls, behavioral models built from every conversation he'd ever recorded. It was disgusting, if you thought about it long enough. But Elias did not allow himself long thoughts. Long thoughts wandered off script. His system did one thing: it predicted outcomes. Not the kind of outcomes that belonged to numbers, the kind that belonged to people. Would this person stay? Would this apology work? Would this relationship end in betrayal, boredom, or burial? He called it the oracle. He told himself it was just optimization. He told himself it saved time. He told himself it prevented pain. But the real reason he loved the oracle was simpler and more shameful. It gave him permission to feel. On Monday nights, Elias ran connection simulations, the way other people planned meals. He didn't date often because dating was messy and required uncertainty, and uncertainty made his jaw ache. But when he did it like he did everything, with a pre-check. He met women who were kind and intelligent, and, with the patience of the emotionally brave, tried to teach him that affection was not a spreadsheet. They all failed. Not because they weren't enough, because they could not compete with the future. Elias would sit across from them in restaurants, nodding at the right moments, smiling when his face received the cue, asking questions that were technically intimate and spiritually empty. And in his mind, behind the conversation, there would be a quiet second conversation, a dialogue with the oracle he never spoke aloud. Probability of long-term compatibility, 63%. Probability of mutual satisfaction beyond 18 months, 28%. Probability of betrayal event, 19%. Confidence medium. Numbers like those did not frighten him, they comforted him. If the probability of betrayal was high, he ended it early. He called it being honest. He called it not wasting her time. He called it maturity. What he never called it was what it actually was: cowardice with a user interface. The oracle had predicted his first divorce before his first marriage was even official. Lena, 26, warm laugh, small hands that always found his when they crossed a street. Elias had married her because the oracle gave him a rare green light. Success probability, 74%. 74% felt like fate. The marriage lasted 2 years and 3 months. She left him on a Tuesday morning after placing a cup of coffee on the counter that was too hot to be kind and saying quietly, "You don't love me, Elias. You love the idea that I won't hurt you." He tried to argue. He tried to show her the numbers. He said, "But look, we were supposed to work." She looked at him like he had spoken in a dead language. "There it is," she said. That word, supposed. And then she was gone. Elias didn't cry that day. He updated his model. He added variables. He increased the data intake. He purchased new access to predictive streams. He made the oracle better. That was his grief. Upgrades. He did not notice at first that the oracle had begun to hesitate. Not with errors, not with warnings, not with red text that would allow him to treat it like a normal failure. No, the oracle's failure was more insulting than that. It behaved as if the future had stopped being a valid field. It began with small things. A week after the withdrawal, though the news still hadn't found the right word for it yet, Elias asked a harmless question out of habit. Should I take the job offer? The oracle returned. Current state, you are employed. You are dissatisfied. You have an offer. And then nothing. No projection. No outcome. No probability curve. Elias frowned, refreshed the panel, checked the logs, ran diagnostics. Everything passed. The oracle didn't say it was broken. It simply refused to answer. He told himself it was a glitch, a server timeout, a corrupted dataset. He told himself it would be fixed by morning, because morning was when things got fixed. Morning was the moment the world renewed its contract with continuation. But the next morning came like a lie, because the future did not return. It withdrew. Not dramatically, not as a catastrophe that earned sirens and headlines. It withdrew like a witness refusing to testify, like a door quietly locking, like a phone line that no longer rang because the other side had decided not to pick up ever again. In the first 24 hours, the public noticed in small, humiliating ways. GPS systems stopped giving arrival times. Weather apps stopped offering forecasts beyond now. Health trackers stopped estimating sleep debt and recovery. Investment dashboards stopped projecting growth. At first, people laughed. They blamed updates. Then they stopped laughing. Elias didn't stop laughing either. He didn't laugh at the world. He laughed at himself. Because he was the kind of man who had built his entire emotional infrastructure on the assumption that tomorrow was cooperative. And now tomorrow had resigned. In the weeks following, Elias watched humanity do what it always did when something sacred collapsed. It tried to turn the collapse into content. Social media filled with jokes, memes about no future mode, influencers performing staged breakdowns, podcasts debating whether this was a psychological mass event or a cosmic punishment or a government experiment. Elias didn't join the debate. He didn't need theories. He needed answers. He needed the oracle to speak. He sat at his desk every night, lit only by the soft glow of screens that now displayed nothing but the present, and he asked the oracle questions the way a man might ask a locked door to become a doorway again. Will I be okay? Will the world stabilize? Will I ever love someone without fear? The oracle returned only. Current state, you are asking. Current state, you are afraid. Current state, there is no response beyond now. At first, Elias believed this was universal, that everyone had lost tomorrow. But then he began to hear stories. A friend said, I had a dream last night. It felt like a warning, like I saw something. A colleague confessed, I just knew not to take the highway. I can't explain it. A neighbor whispered in the elevator, my phone showed a message. Not from anyone. It told me to call my sister. It said, don't wait. Elias asked, too quickly, did you do it? His neighbor nodded. And Elias felt something strange, something that did not fit into any variable he had ever modeled. Envy, not of her sister, of her message. The future was speaking, just not to him. The first time Elias received anything that could be described as communication, it happened on a Thursday night. An ordinary night made monstrous by the fact that ordinary no longer meant safe. He was making tea in his kitchen. The kettle whistled in a way that sounded almost human, pleading. The air smelled of citrus and metal. He stared at the steam rising like a ghost that couldn't decide whether to become a cloud or die as water. And then, in the silence between the kettle's scream and the moment he reached to turn it off, he heard it. Not with his ears, inside. A voice that did not belong to memory, because it didn't sound like anyone he knew. A voice without accent, without age, without warmth. It did not speak like a person speaking. It spoke like a verdict arriving. You keep asking what comes next. Elias froze. His hand hovered above the stove knob. The kettle continued to whistle. The voice continued. That question no longer belongs to you. His throat tightened. He managed a whisper. Who is this? No answer. Instead, his phone lit up on the counter, screen bright as an accusation, showing text that no app had generated, no sender had sent. You borrowed tomorrow like it was yours. You spent it like it was infinite. You asked for permission to feel. You did not feel. Elias stared at the words until the letters blurred, not from tears. His eyes were dry, but from the brain's refusal to accept that reality could write him messages. His fingers reached for the screen. He didn't touch it, because he was afraid that touching it would make it go away. The next line appeared. You called it careful. We call it waste. Elias's pulse began to hammer. He felt, for the first time in years, the raw animal panic beneath his polished restraint. He wanted to deny it. He wanted to argue. He wanted to say, I prevented pain. I avoided disaster. I chose responsibly. But the message didn't care about explanations. It cared about accounting. Another line. The future did not withdraw from the world. It withdrew from those who used it as an excuse. Elias's breath caught. That's not true, he said aloud, like speaking could negotiate with whatever had just spoken. The screen went dark. The kitchen went quiet. And Elias stood in his clean apartment, holding a kettle that had stopped screaming, feeling the specific terror of a man realizing the universe had been watching his private cowardice and had finally decided it was time to name it. He did not sleep. He did what he always did when fear arrived. He analyzed. He opened his system logs, combed through network traces, checked for intrusions. He isolated his phone, ran malware scans, verified firmware integrity. He did everything that a rational man would do to prove that the irrational had not occurred. Everything came back clean, too clean, like reality had not been hacked, like reality had simply decided. At 3:11 a.m., he sat back from the screens and admitted the thought he had been resisting. This was not technology. This was the future. Not as a metaphor, not as an abstract concept, as an entity, as a presence, as something with agency, something that could choose to answer some people and not others. And Elias, who had spent his whole life seeking permission, understood the cruelty of what was happening to him. He was being denied, not globally, personally. He had never truly apologized to Lena because the oracle said later. He had never called his mother because the oracle said not necessary. He had never taken risks because the oracle said low ROI. He had never loved freely because the oracle said uncertain outcome. And now the future had done to him what he had done to everyone else. It had closed the door early. No explanation, no negotiation, just an ending without warning. The next day, Elias did something he hadn't done in years. He went outside without a plan. He walked through the city as if he was trying to find a new direction in a world where direction had become questionable. The streets were full, but the movement was different now, less purposeful, more frantic. People still went to work, but with the expression of actors in a play they no longer believed in. Conversations sounded like rehearsals. Smiles looked borrowed. On a corner near a coffee shop, he saw a woman with a handwritten sign. Not a profit sign. Not "the end is here." Something smaller, more intimate. If you're waiting for the right moment, stop. Elias slowed. The woman looked at him. Her eyes were tired, but alive. The sign trembled in her hands like it was heavy with truth. Elias felt his chest tighten, not with romance, not yet, but with recognition. He had been waiting his whole life. He stepped closer. What do you mean? He asked. She studied his face like she could see the shape of his habits. I mean, she said softly, the future started charging interest. Elias swallowed. You've heard it too? Her eyes flicked to his phone, like she knew it had spoken. Not heard, she said. Received. From what? She didn't answer directly. She looked past him, toward the skyline, toward the blank horizon of time. It's not warning anymore, she said. It's accounting. Elias's mouth went dry. Why me? The woman's gaze returned to him, steady as a knife. Because, she said, some people didn't lose tomorrow. Some people had tomorrow repossessed. Elias flinched. He wanted to insist he didn't deserve that word. Repossessed sounded like theft, sounded like punishment. But then he remembered every time he had ended something early to avoid pain, every time he had waited for certainty before giving affection, every time he had treated a human being like a future investment. He looked at the woman and asked the question he had never asked anyone honestly. How do you get it back? The woman's expression shifted. Something like pity, something like warning. You don't, she said. Not the way you want, not by demanding it. Elias's jaw clenched. Then how? She stepped closer until Elias could see the faint tremor in her hands, the signs of someone who had been awake too long because sleep required the faith that tomorrow would still exist when you woke. You act, she said, without permission. Elias shook his head. as if the words were physically unbearable. That's, he almost said reckless, but the word felt too honest. That's impossible. No, she said. It's human. She lowered her sign, and for the first time, Elias saw the name scrawled at the bottom in smaller letters, almost an afterthought. Mara. And he felt a cold recognition run through him, because he had seen the name in the news feeds, in the fringe forums, in the desperate messages shared between scientists who still pretended science could function without prediction. Dr. Mara Voss, the woman who studied time when time still pretended it could be studied. Elias opened his mouth to speak her name, and his phone lit up again. One line. Nothing else. You found someone who doesn't ask for permission. Watch what she does next. Do not call it love. Earn the word. Elias stared at the message, and for the first time in his life, he felt something that was not validated, not optimized, not pre-approved. Fear, yes, but beneath it, a small, dangerous spark. Something like desire. Not desire for a person. Desire for a different way of existing. Mara looked at his face and seemed to understand what the message had done to him. You're going to want to run back to your screens, she said. To your numbers. Elias swallowed. Yeah, he admitted. Mara nodded. Of course you are. That's what you built your life around. But if you do, it will go silent again. Elias asked, voice cracking, How do you know? Mara's eyes were hard now. Because it happened to me, she said. Every time I demanded an answer, it punished me with silence. Every time I stopped demanding, every time I acted, sometimes it showed me a glimpse. A glimpse of what? Mara's gaze went distant, as if she was watching something behind his shoulders. A future, she said. Not yours, not mine, something else. Elias's throat tightened. What do I do? Mara lifted the sign again, but now it was not for the world. It was for him. Stop waiting, she said. Call someone you should have called years ago. Elias stiffened. You don't know, Mara interrupted, gentle but firm. We all know. That's the point. You've been pretending not to. Elias's phone vibrated in his palm. One final line appeared. Your first test is small. Call the one you kept for later. Later is canceled. Elias stood on the sidewalk with traffic flowing like meaningless blood around him, a woman holding a sign beside him, and the future, whatever it was, pressing its cold finger into the bruise of his life. He knew exactly who it meant. Lena. He hadn't spoken to her in 7 years. He had always planned to apologize someday. Someday was a future word. Someday had just been removed from his vocabulary. Elias's thumb hovered over her contact. The screen blurred, not from tears. From the sheer weight of a moment he could no longer postpone. Mara watched him with the expression of someone witnessing a rare event, a man stepping into the present without armor. Elias pressed call. It rang, once, twice, 3 times, and then a click, a breath, a voice he recognized like pain. Hello? Elias opened his mouth. For once, the oracle did not speak first. For once, the future did not give permission. For once, the words had to come from him. And in the silence before he spoke, something in the air changed, subtle, electric, like the world leaning closer to listen. As if the future itself had paused to see whether he could finally do what he had always avoided, love without certainty. He whispered, Lena, I'm sorry. And for the first time since the withdrawal, Elias felt it. Not a forecast, not a probability, a response. Not from the oracle, from somewhere deeper. Somewhere that felt like tomorrow, trying to decide whether he deserved to exist. The man who borrowed a future that wasn't his. Part 2. The future does not forgive those who wait. Section 1. The tests begin. The call with Lena lasted 11 minutes. Elias counted every second, not because his systems were tracking anymore, they had stopped tracking anything useful, but because counting was the only way his mind could process the experience of speaking without a script, of listening without a forecast, of existing in a conversation whose outcome had not been pre-approved by anything. She did not forgive him. She did not say she was still angry. She said something worse. I'm glad you called, she said, her voice older than he remembered, carrying the weight of 7 years that had not included him. But I don't know what you want me to do with this. Elias had no answer. He had spent his entire adult life preparing answers in advance, crafting responses that would optimize outcomes, building linguistic bridges to destinations he had already mapped. Now he stood on a sidewalk in the middle of a city that had forgotten how to predict its own traffic. and he had nothing to offer except the truth. "I don't know either," he admitted. "I just needed to say it." There was a pause on the line. Not the calculated pause of someone gathering ammunition, but the genuine pause of someone who had stopped expecting anything from him and was now confronting the strangeness of receiving something anyway. "Why now?" she asked. Elias looked at Mara, who was still standing beside him, her sign lowered, her eyes watching him with the patient attention of someone observing a species she had almost given up on. "Because," he said, "I ran out of later." Lena exhaled slowly. "That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me." The call ended without resolution. No promise of reconciliation, no dramatic reunion. Just two people who had once shared a life, acknowledging that the life had existed, that it had mattered, that it had been wasted, and that the waste could be named without being undone. Elias lowered his phone. His hands were shaking, and in his pocket he felt the device vibrate with a message he had not requested. He pulled it out, one line. The first test was apology without expectation. You passed. The second test begins now. Elias looked up at Mara, his heart pounding. "What did it say?" she asked. He showed her the screen. Her expression didn't change. "Of course," she said quietly. "It's not enough to apologize once. The future doesn't give partial credit." "What do you mean?" Mara gestured for him to follow her. They walked together through streets that had once been orderly and were now merely populated, people still moving, still transacting, still performing the rituals of civilization, but with the hollow quality of actors who had lost their scripts and were improvising badly. "The withdrawal isn't uniform," Mara explained as they walked. "Some people lost everything at once. Some people are being tested piece by piece. The future isn't gone, it's selective. It's choosing who deserves access." "Based on what?" Mara stopped at a crosswalk. The light was red, but no cars were coming. She looked at him. "Based on whether you've been using it as an excuse." Elias frowned. "An excuse for what?" "For not living," Mara said. "For not choosing. For not loving. For treating tomorrow like a safety net that would catch you if you never jumped." The light turned green. Neither of them moved. "The future withdrew from you specifically," Mara continued, "because you borrowed more than anyone. You took out loans against tomorrow to justify never doing anything today, and now the debt is being called in." Elias felt the words land in his chest like stones dropped into still water. He wanted to argue. He wanted to say that he had been responsible, that he had been careful, that he had been protecting himself from the pain that came from betting on uncertain outcomes. But the arguments wouldn't form, because he knew she was right. He had called it caution. The future called it waste. Poor Gore. The second test arrived 3 hours later, in a hospital waiting room where Elias had no business being. He had followed Mara to a facility where she was visiting someone. She didn't say who, and he didn't ask. And while she was inside, he had sat in the waiting area, watching the peculiar despair of people who could no longer be told how long they had to wait. That was one of the cruelties of the withdrawal that the news hadn't fully captured. Waiting had become unbearable. Not because the wait was longer, because it was unmeasured. Before, you could endure almost anything if you knew when it would end. A 3-hour wait was survivable because 3 hours had a shape, a boundary, a terminus. Now waiting had no shape. You simply existed in suspension until suspension ended, and you had no way of knowing whether that would be minutes or days or never. Elias sat in a plastic chair and watched a man across the room, older, maybe 60, wearing the disheveled appearance of someone who had stopped caring about appearances because caring required energy that was no longer available. The man was holding a phone, staring at it, waiting for something. And Elias, without understanding why, felt compelled to approach him. "Are you okay?" he asked, the words strange in his mouth, because he had never asked that question without knowing the answer in advance, without having some model that predicted what response would follow. The man looked up. His eyes were red. "My daughter," he said. "She's in surgery. They can't tell me how long. They can't tell me the odds. They can't tell me anything." Elias nodded, not knowing what to say. "Before," the man continued, "they would have said 70% survival rate or expect 6 hours. Now they just say, we're doing everything we can." "I'm sorry," Elias said. The man laughed bitterly. Everyone's sorry. Sorry doesn't tell me if I'll see her again. Elias sat down beside him. Not because he had a plan, not because he knew what would help, because sitting felt like the only thing he could do. They sat in silence for a long time, and then the man said quietly, "I was supposed to visit her last month. She asked me to come. I said I'd come when things were less busy." Elias felt his own breath catch. "Things were never going to be less busy," the man said. "I was just waiting for a better time." "There's never a better time," Elias said. Lop, and the words surprised him because they sounded like wisdom, and he had never considered himself wise. The man looked at him. "No," he agreed, "there isn't." They sat together until the surgeon emerged. Hours later, or maybe minutes, time had become impossible to measure, and delivered news that was neither good nor bad, just uncertain. The daughter would live, or she wouldn't. The surgery had gone well, or it hadn't. No one could say. The man stood, shook Elias's hand, and walked toward the recovery ward without looking back. Elias's phone buzzed. The second test was presence without purpose. "You passed. You have one test remaining." Elias stared at the message. One test remaining. He didn't know what it would be. He didn't know when it would arrive. He only knew that the future was watching, was measuring, was deciding whether he deserved access to something he had spent his entire life taking for granted.
Okay.
The third test came that night, in Mara's apartment, which turned out to be less an apartment and more a shrine to obsession. Every wall was covered in diagrams, equations, printouts of data that no longer meant anything. Screens displayed frozen forecasts from before the withdrawal, weather patterns, market projections, population models, preserved like artifacts from a civilization that had collapsed. "I've been studying this for 17 years, Mara said, pouring tea that neither of them would drink. "I saw the withdrawal coming. I documented the gradual retreat. I published papers that no one read, gave presentations that no one attended, built models that no one believed." "And now?" Elias asked. Mara set down the teapot. "Now I understand that I was part of the problem." Elias frowned. "How?" "Because I studied the future instead of living in the present," she said. "Because I turned prophecy into data. Because I was so busy documenting what was coming that I never did anything about it." She sat down across from him. "The future didn't withdraw because we ignored it," she said. "It withdrew because we obsessed over it, because we demanded it, because we treated it like a service we were entitled to instead of a gift we had to earn." Elias thought about his oracle, about the years he had spent asking it for permission to feel, about the way he had reduced love to probability and connection to calculation, and the sacred mystery of human relationship to a spreadsheet that could be optimized. "How do you earn it back?" he asked. Mara's expression was unreadable. "That's what the tests are for," she said, "to see if you're capable of acting without certainty, of choosing without guarantees, of loving without knowing if you'll be loved in return." "And if I fail?" Mara was quiet for a long moment. "Then you stay in the present," she said. "Forever. No access to tomorrow. No glimpses, no warnings, just an endless now that stretches until it doesn't." Elias felt the weight of that sentence press down on him. An endless now. He had thought that sounded peaceful once, being present, being mindful, existing in the moment without anxiety about what came next. But he understood now that presence without future was not peace. It was prison, a cell with no walls that you could never escape because there was nowhere else to go. "The third test," he said. "When does it come?" Mara looked at him with something that might have been pity. "It already started," she said, "the moment you asked that question." Elias's blood went cold. "What do you mean?" Mara leaned forward. "The third test isn't a moment," she said. "It's a person. Someone you have to choose without any signal from the future. Someone whose outcome you can't predict, whose trajectory you can't model, whose heart you can't audit before you commit." Elias thought of everyone he had ever dated, every relationship he had ever evaluated, every connection he had ever severed because the numbers didn't add up. "Who?" he asked. Mara stood and walked to the window. "That's for you to decide," she said. "But I should warn you, the future won't help. It won't confirm your choice. It won't tell you if you're right. It will be completely, utterly silent." Elias swallowed. "And if I choose wrong?" Mara turned back to him. "Then you'll know what it means to be human," she said. because humans choose wrong all the time. That's not failure, that's living. Elias sat in her apartment, surrounded by the wreckage of her obsession, and felt the specific terror of a man who had built his entire life on certainty, being told that certainty was the problem. He had to choose someone, without knowing, without predicting, without the oracle's permission. Just him, just trust, just the blind leap that he had spent 38 years avoiding. The future had given him 2 tests. He had passed both. Now it was asking him to do the one thing he had never been able to do, love without a safety net. And somewhere in the architecture of whatever entity was watching, something was waiting to see if he would finally stop waiting. Section 2. The future audits love. In the days that followed, Elias began to notice patterns he had previously been too focused on his own crisis to see, patterns in the way the world was reorganizing itself around the withdrawal, in the specific shape of the collapse that was unfolding, not with explosions but with quiet, systematic denials. The future was not punishing humanity, it was auditing it. The distinction mattered in ways that took time to understand. Punishment implied cruelty, implied a desire to cause suffering, implied an emotional investment in the outcome of the suffering. Audit implied something colder, something more methodical, something that was simply reviewing records, checking receipts, determining who had paid what they owed and who had accumulated debts that could no longer be ignored. Elias saw it first in the news, not the breaking headlines, which were still focused on the dramatic surface of the crisis, but in the smaller stories, the local reports, the patterns that emerged when you looked at enough individual cases side by side. A man in Argentina had received a message: "You promised to visit your father. You waited until it was too late. The waiting was your decision." A woman in Japan had received a message: "You knew he was hurting. You chose not to see. Blindness chosen is not blindness excused." A teacher in Nigeria had received a message: "You had students who needed you. You gave them what was convenient. Convenience is not care." Each message was different. Each was addressed to a specific person about specific choices. But the structure was identical: acknowledgement of what was known, acknowledgement of what was chosen, acknowledgement that the choosing was deliberate, and then silence. The future didn't threaten consequences. It didn't promise punishment. It simply named what had happened and left the person to live with the naming. That was the horror. Not what the future might do, what it had recorded. Elias understood now why so many people were retreating into denial, why the official explanations kept focusing on technical failures and systemic glitches, why the authorities kept promising that normal service would resume shortly, even though everyone could feel that normal had been permanently redefined. Accepting the truth meant accepting that you had been watched, that every small betrayal, every postponed kindness, every love withheld for safety's sake had been documented, that nothing had been private, that the audit had been running your entire life. Mara called it borrowed tomorrows. Every time you said, "I'll do it later," she explained, you were borrowing against a tomorrow that wasn't guaranteed. Every time you postponed something that mattered, you were taking out a loan. And now the loans are being called in, Elias said. The loans are being audited, Mara corrected. Some people paid as they went. They did the hard things when the hard things needed doing. They apologized without waiting. They loved without permission. They lived as if tomorrow might not come. And those people, the future still speaks to them, Mara said. Not clearly, not predictably, but it speaks, it gives glimpses, it offers warnings, it participates in their lives because they participated in it. But people like me, people like you borrowed more than you ever intended to repay, Mara said. And borrowing without repaying has a cost, always has. The withdrawal just made the cost visible. Elias thought about his oracle, about all the times it had told him to wait, to delay, to optimize the timing of actions he could have taken immediately. He had thought he was being strategic. He had been accumulating debt. Every relationship he ended early to avoid pain, borrowed time. Every conversation he postponed until conditions were better, borrowed courage. Every "I love you" he withheld until certainty arrived, borrowed connection. Now the borrowing had stopped, and the interest was coming due. He saw the failures everywhere he looked. A couple in the cafe where he stopped for coffee, young, maybe mid-20s, sitting across from each other in the particular silence of people who had run out of things to say to each other. He watched them for a moment, and then he saw the woman's phone light up. Her face went pale. She read something. She didn't show it to the man across from her. She just stood up, gathered her things, and walked out without a word. The man sat there, confused, abandoned, not understanding what had just happened. Elias understood. She had received her audit, and whatever it said had been enough to make her leave. Not in anger, not in despair, but in the cold recognition that staying was no longer possible. He saw it again an hour later, in a park where he walked to clear his head. An older woman on a bench, staring at a phone, weeping silently. A businessman standing on a corner, his face gray, his briefcase forgotten at his feet. A teenager sitting on the grass, not moving, not speaking, just existing in the aftermath of something that had shattered the comfortable fiction of his life. Each one had been audited. Each one had been shown the record of their borrowing. Each one was now living with the knowledge that the future they had counted on had never actually belonged to them. Borrowed tomorrows. The phrase echoed in Elias's mind as he walked. How many tomorrows had he borrowed? How many had he wasted? How much interest had accumulated on a debt he had never acknowledged? The answer, he suspected, was more than he could calculate, more than his oracle had ever modeled, more than any system designed to optimize outcomes could have anticipated, because the oracle had been built on the assumption that tomorrow would always arrive, and that assumption had been wrong. Tomorrow was not a given. Tomorrow was a loan. And the lender had finally decided to check the books. Section 3. Section 3. Mara's confession. I need to tell you something, Mara said on the fourth night when they had retreated to her apartment after another day of watching the world reorganize itself around an absence it couldn't acknowledge. Elias was sitting on her couch, exhausted in ways that went beyond physical fatigue, his mind still processing the constant low-level horror of a reality that had decided to stop cooperating with human expectations. What? He asked. Mara sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold, her eyes carrying the specific weight of someone about to admit something they had been carrying alone for too long. I didn't just study the withdrawal, she said. I caused part of it. Elias blinked. What do you mean? Mara set down the cup. 17 years ago, I built a system, she said. Not like your oracle. Something different. Something designed to interact with temporal probability at a deeper level. Interact how? Mara's jaw tightened. Control. The word hung in the air like smoke. I believed that if I could understand the mechanism of prediction, I could strengthen it, make it more reliable, give humanity better access to what was coming. And instead, Mara laughed bitterly. Instead, I discovered something that changed everything I thought I knew about time. She stood, walked to one of her walls of diagrams, traced a complex pattern with her finger. The future isn't a place, she said. It's not a destination we're traveling toward. It's not even a probability distribution waiting to collapse into actuality. Elias waited. The future is a relationship, Mara said, between what we do now and what happens next, between choice and consequence, between present and possibility. She turned back to him. And like all relationships, it can be damaged. How? By treating it as a resource instead of a gift, by demanding instead of asking, by controlling instead of participating. She sat back down, suddenly looking older than her years. I spent a decade trying to control the future, she said, trying to force it to reveal itself on my terms, trying to make prophecy a technology instead of a mystery. And the future withdrew? From me first, Mara said. Years before the global withdrawal, I was one of the first, one of the pioneers of losing tomorrow. Elias felt a chill run through him. How did you survive? Mara's expression shifted, something like grief, something like resignation. I learned the rule, she said, the only rule that matters. Which is, Mara leaned forward, the future only appears to those who stop using it as an excuse. Elias frowned. An excuse for what? For not living now, for postponing hard choices, for treating tomorrow as a safety net that would catch everything you were too afraid to hold today. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small device, old, battered, something that might have been a phone or a tablet, its screen cracked and dark. "This was my system," she said, "the thing I built to control the future. I kept it as a reminder." "A reminder of what?" "Of what happens when you demand answers instead of earning them." She held the device out to him. "Look at the last thing it ever showed me." Elias took it hesitantly. The screen flickered to life, just for a moment, just long enough to display a single image. It was Mara, but wrong. Older, hollow, standing in a room that looked like her apartment but emptier, stripped of everything that made it human. And in the image, Mara was smiling, not a real smile, a smile that had no emotion behind it, no joy, no sorrow, nothing at all. The smile of someone who had been waiting so long for something that would never arrive that they had forgotten what waiting felt like. The screen went dark. "That was the last glimpse I ever received," Mara said, taking the device back. "A vision of what I would become if I kept demanding the future show itself." Elias swallowed. "What happened?" "I stopped demanding," Mara said. "I gave up control. I started living as if tomorrow might never come, not from despair but from acceptance. And sometimes, rarely, unpredictably, without any pattern I can identify, I get glimpses again, brief moments where the veil parts and I see something." "What do you see?" Mara was quiet for a long moment. "Things that terrify me more than blankness," she said finally. "Futures that exist but that I can't change. Outcomes that are coming regardless of what anyone does, the shape of what we're becoming." Elias felt the question forming before he could stop it. "What are we becoming?" Mara met his eyes. "I don't know," she said. "That's the terrifying part. The glimpses show pieces, fragments, moments out of context. But the pattern they form—" She shook her head. "It's not hopeless," she said. "But it's not what anyone expects. It's not the apocalypse the movies promised. It's something else, something stranger, something that makes me glad sometimes that I can't see more than I can see." Elias sat with that for a long moment. The future as something worse than blankness. The future as something that terrified even someone who had spent her life studying it. "What do I do?" he asked finally. Mara's expression softened. "The same thing I did," she said. "Stop demanding. Stop waiting. Start living as if every moment is the only moment you get. And if I do that, then maybe, the future will decide you're worth speaking to again." "Maybe," Mara smiled, and for the first time, the smile reached her eyes. "There are no guarantees," she said. "That's the whole point." Elias understood. The future didn't answer demands. It only answered those who had stopped needing answers. It only appeared to those who had learned to live without it. It only returned to those who had proved they could survive its absence. The paradox was perfect. The trap was complete. And the only way out was through. Section 4. The Woman with No Forecast. Her name was Vera. Elias met her on the 6th day, in a bookstore that was still open, despite having no way to order inventory, no way to schedule deliveries, no way to do any of the planning that kept businesses alive in a world where planning was possible. The owner had decided to stay open anyway. "If I close," she had told Elias when he asked, "I'll be sitting at home waiting for something that might never come. At least here I'm doing something." It was that attitude, the stubborn refusal to surrender to the blankness, that had drawn him to the store. And it was there, browsing shelves of books that described futures that had already been written, that he saw Vera. She was reading in the corner, not on a device, a physical book. Her dark hair fell across her face, obscuring her expression. But there was something in the way she sat, completely absorbed, completely present, completely unaware of the chaos outside the windows, that made Elias stop. He watched her for longer than was polite. He didn't mean to. He just couldn't look away. And then she looked up, caught him staring, and smiled. Not the nervous smile of someone who had been watched without permission, the amused smile of someone who didn't particularly care about permission. "You're the third person today who's done that," she said. "Is there something on my face?" "No," Elias managed. "Sorry, I just what?" He didn't have an answer. The Oracle would have had an answer. The Oracle would have calculated an optimal approach, suggested a conversation starter, estimated the probability of various outcomes. But the Oracle was silent. The future was silent, and Elias was just a man standing in a bookstore, looking at a woman who was waiting for him to say something that wasn't a calculation. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't know what I just." Vera laughed. It was a real laugh, warm, surprised, the kind of laugh that escaped before the person decided whether to let it out. "That's the most honest answer anyone's given me in a week," she said. "Sit down. Tell me why you don't know." Elias sat. They talked. He told her about the oracle, about his system, about the way he had spent his entire life seeking permission to feel. She listened without judgment. Then she told him about herself. "I've never had what you're describing," she said. "Never had systems or predictions or any of that. I've always just lived." "How?" Elias asked, genuinely bewildered. "How do you make decisions without knowing the outcomes?" Vera shrugged. "You guess," she said. "You feel. You pay attention to what matters and ignore what doesn't and hope you're not completely wrong. And when you're wrong, then you learn something," she said, "and you try again." It sounded so simple when she said it, so obvious. But Elias understood that for him, it had never been obvious. For him, trying, without certainty, had always felt like failure waiting to happen, like walking into traffic blindfolded, like jumping off a cliff and hoping the ground had decided to be soft today. And yet here was a woman who had lived her entire life that way, who had made choices without forecasts, who had loved without audits, who had existed in uncertainty, not as a prisoner, but as a resident. "Can I ask you something?" Elias said. "Sure. Since the withdrawal, have you received any messages, any communication from whatever is doing this?" Vera's expression flickered, not with fear, not with recognition, but with something that looked almost like curiosity. "No," she said, "nothing." Elias frowned. "Nothing at all?" "Complete silence," Vera said. "No judgments, no tests, no verdicts, just quiet." "Doesn't that terrify you?" Vera considered the question. "It did at first," she said. "Everyone around me was getting these messages, these audits, these pronouncements about what they had done wrong, and I kept waiting for mine. And it never came," she said, "so I stopped waiting." Elias felt something shift in his chest. Not understanding, not yet, but the precursor to understanding. "Why do you think you haven't received anything?" he asked. Vera smiled. "Maybe because I never borrowed anything," she said. "Never counted on tomorrow to fix what today needed fixing. Never used the future as an excuse." She reached across the table and touched his hand. It was not a romantic gesture. It was not calculated or strategic. It was just contact, human contact, without agenda, without expectation. "You spent your whole life asking the future for permission," she said. "I spent mine not asking. Maybe that's why it has nothing to say to me." Elias looked at her hand on his. He thought about the third test, about choosing someone without signals, about loving without knowing, and he understood, with sudden clarity, that Vera was the answer he had been waiting for. Not because she was perfect, not because his systems approved, but because she was unknowable. Because the future refused to comment on her. Because choosing her would require exactly the thing he had spent his entire life avoiding, trust without verification. "I need to tell you something," he said. Vera waited. "I'm being tested," he said, "by the future, or whatever the future has become, and I think you're part of the test." Vera didn't pull her hand away. "What does the test require?" she asked. "That I choose," Elias said, "without knowing, without predicting, without any guarantee that the choice is right." Vera's expression was unreadable. "And what do you want to do?" she asked. Elias looked at her, at this woman who lived without forecasts, who had never needed permission to feel, who existed in uncertainty as naturally as he had existed in calculation, and felt the weight of 38 years of avoidance pressing against his chest. He could walk away. He could preserve his safety. He could continue waiting for a certainty that would never arrive. Or he could choose. Now, without permission, without the oracle, without anything except the desperate, terrifying hope that choice itself was enough. "I want to know you," he said. "I want to try, even if I don't know how it ends." Vera smiled. "Then try," she said. "That's all anyone can do." Elias felt his phone buzz in his pocket. He didn't look at it. For the first time in his life, he didn't look. He kept his eyes on Vera, and whatever the message said, whatever verdict the future had delivered, he let it wait, because she was right. Trying was all anyone could do. and he had spent too long not trying to waste another moment on waiting. Section 5. The Verdict. The message arrived 3 days later, after Elias had begun something he didn't have a name for yet. Something that might have been the beginning of love, might have been the beginning of failure, might have been both at once in the way that all human connections were both at once. He was alone in his apartment when it came. Not alone by choice. Alone because Vera had gone to visit her mother, because she had a life that didn't revolve around him, because she was the kind of person who did things when they needed doing instead of waiting for optimal conditions. He had watched her go with something that felt like fear, but might have been wonder. She existed without him. She would continue existing without him. She didn't need him the way he had always needed certainty. And somehow, that made him want her more. He was sitting on his couch, staring at the blank wall where his oracle's display used to hang. He had taken it down, unable to look at screens that showed only the present, when his phone lit up with a message he had not requested. Not the short, cold verdicts he had received before. Something longer. Something that felt like a conclusion. Elias Mercer, you have completed your tests. Now you will receive your audit. Elias's blood went cold. He picked up the phone. The text continued. You spent 38 years asking for permission. You requested 4,891 forecasts about romantic compatibility. You ended 23 relationships based on probability alone. You waited 7 years to apologize to Lena. You never told your mother you loved her because the timing was never optimal. You called it careful. We call it waste. Elias's hands were shaking. The message continued. But waste is not the worst sin. The worst sin is knowing. Knowing that love required risk and choosing safety anyway. Knowing that connection required vulnerability and choosing armor anyway. Knowing that living required uncertainty and choosing paralysis anyway. You did not fail because you chose wrong. You failed because you refused to choose. Elias read the words and felt them land like blows. Each one accurate, each one deserved. Each one a mirror held up to a life spent hiding from the very thing that made life worth living. The message continued. Hatred is loud. Hatred is visible. Hatred can be fought, but emotional cowardice is silent. Emotional cowardice is invisible. Emotional cowardice destroys without announcing itself. The man who hates burns bridges. The man who waits lets them rot. Both men stand on the same side of the river in the end, but the waiter pretends he had no choice. Elias was crying now, not loud sobs, quiet tears, the tears of someone finally facing what they had spent their whole life avoiding. You were chosen for this audit not because you were worst, but because you were representative. Billions of humans borrowed the future to justify not living in the present. Billions treated tomorrow as an excuse. You are not special, but you are complete. A perfect example of the specific cowardice that made the withdrawal necessary. The words hit like a verdict, because they were a verdict. A judgment delivered by whatever entity now controlled access to the future. Whatever intelligence had decided that humanity's relationship with tomorrow had become so corrupted that it needed to be severed. The final lines appeared. You passed your tests, not because you succeeded, because you tried. That is all that was ever required. That is all that was ever asked. Try, without knowing, without permission, without the safety net you spent your whole life demanding. The future does not owe you answers. The future does not owe you forecasts. The future does not owe you anything, but it notices, it watches, it remembers, and sometimes, rarely, it rewards. Not with certainty, with glimpses, enough to know that tomorrow exists, not enough to control it. That is the new arrangement. That is the price of continuation. Accept it or do not. The choice for once is yours. The screen went dark. The message ended, and Elias sat in his apartment, tears streaming down his face, understanding finally what the withdrawal had always been about. Not punishment, not cruelty, not the arbitrary removal of something humanity needed. Correction. The universe correcting an absurdity. The future refusing to participate in a relationship where it was taken for granted. The mysterious dimension of possibility demanding to be treated with respect instead of entitled expectation. He had failed for 38 years, but the tests had proved he could change. That was enough, not for redemption, not for forgiveness, just for continuation, just for the chance to try again. And that The verdict implied was more than most people would ever receive. He went to see his mother. Section 6. The irreversible moment. The next morning, Elias made a choice. Not a calculated choice. Not an optimized choice. A human choice. He went to see his mother. She lived 3 hours away, in a retirement community he had visited exactly 4 times in the past decade. Always briefly, always with excuses about being busy, always with the unspoken assumption that there would be more time later. Later was canceled. He drove without GPS because GPS couldn't predict arrival times anymore. He drove without music because he needed the silence to prepare. He drove without knowing what he would say when he arrived, because for once not knowing didn't feel like failure. It felt like freedom. His mother was 81 years old. She had been waiting for him for years. Not demanding, not complaining, just waiting. The way mothers wait when they love their children more than their children can understand until they become parents themselves. He found her in the garden behind her building, tending to flowers that would bloom or not bloom according to processes that no one could predict anymore. She looked up when she saw him. Her face registered surprise, then something else. Something that looked like relief so profound it bordered on grief. "Elias," she said. "Mom," he said. And then he was holding her, and she was crying, and he was crying, and neither of them were saying words because words had become inadequate for what was passing between them. Eventually, they sat on a bench. The flowers swayed in a breeze that came from nowhere in particular. "I'm sorry," Elias said, "for all the times I didn't come, for all the calls I didn't make, for all the years I wasted waiting for a better time." His mother took his hand. "I know," she said. "I always knew. That doesn't make it okay." "No," she agreed, "but you're here now." Elias looked at her, at this woman who had raised him, who had loved him, who had watched him become someone who could only love through systems and calculations, and felt the full weight of his waste. The borrowed tomorrows, the accumulated interest, the debt that could never fully be repaid. "I don't know how much time we have left," he said. "No one does anymore." His mother smiled. "We never did," she said. "We just pretended we did. I want to spend more of it with you." "Then do," she said. "That's all I ever wanted. Just time. Your time. Not promises about later. Just presence. Now." Elias felt something in his chest. Not the emptiness of his oracle's silence, but something warmer. Something that might have been the beginning of a different way of living. A way without forecasts. A way without guarantees. A way that treated every moment as the only moment because every moment might be exactly that. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He reached for it. Old habit, automatic response. Then stopped. His mother was watching him. The flowers were swaying. The sun was warm on his face. Whatever the message said, it could wait. This moment couldn't. He left the phone in his pocket. He squeezed his mother's hand. And he stayed. Not because a system told him to. Not because a forecast approved, but because he wanted to. Because love didn't need permission. Because connection didn't require certainty. Because living, real living, meant choosing without knowing, trusting without guaranteeing, being present without calculating the optimal duration of presence. The future had withdrawn. But the present remained. And the present, Elias was finally learning, was enough. It had to be enough. Because it was all anyone ever actually had. That night, alone in his car on the drive home, Elias finally looked at his phone. One message, one line. Tomorrow remains unwritten, but today was good. He stared at the words for a long time. Then he smiled. Not because the future had forgiven him. It hadn't. Not because the audit was complete. It wasn't. But because for the first time in 38 years, he had lived a day without asking what came next. And that, apparently, was noticed. That apparently was enough. He put the phone away. He drove through the darkness toward a city that was still struggling to function without forecasts. He thought about Vera, about his mother, about all the people who were learning, as he was learning, to exist in uncertainty. The future was not coming back, not the way it had been, not as a service to be demanded, but maybe it could be earned, one present moment at a time, one choice at a time, one day at a time. The road stretched ahead of him, dark, unknown, and for the first time in his life, Elias Mercer was not afraid of the darkness. He was just driving through it, towards something he couldn't see, trusting that arrival would happen, or it wouldn't. Either way, he was moving, and moving was better than waiting. Moving was always better than waiting. The future did not answer demands, but it noticed those who stopped demanding, and sometimes, rarely, unpredictably, according to rules no one fully understood, it answered anyway. Not with certainty, with glimpses, and glimpses, Elias was learning, were more than he deserved. More than any of them deserved. But they were offered, and he was finally learning to receive them, not as a right, as a gift, the first gift he had ever truly accepted. The future does not forgive those who wait, but sometimes, it gives them a second chance to stop waiting. Use it. This is all the warning you will receive.